Hello, welcome back. Welcome back to another book review. Like I said, I'm only doing this in relation to film, but also just to kind of also just to stretch out my geeky side that I've been developing now for a little bit. So here we are. I will be keeping my voice down a little bit just because I just got I just got done reading this, and this is like almost towards midnight. So excuse me if my voice is a little bit low. I'll crank it up obviously for the review. Um, but uh, but I just got done reading my latest Superman comic. I've been on Superman kick for a little bit, so I'm probably going to be continuing in that place for a little bit. I'll be stopping for now because I promised my brother I'll be reading one of his books. So I'm going to be taking some time to read one of those for a little bit. But yeah, I just got done reading Superman Red Sun. This was written, I believe, by Mark Miller. I believe that's his name. And I just saw on the Amazon Kindle where I just read the book that he apparently had helped write some Marvel comics, some very famous Marvel comics, those being the Civil War comic and the Old Man Logan comic, which is one that I'm also really interested to read. Both of those I'm interested to read. Um, but yeah, and obviously this has had an adaptation in film, direct to DVD, but still qualifies. In the DC animation department, they did an animated feature a couple of years back. Um, so yeah, so this is a Elseworld story. So this is very separate from the Superman lore as far as just traditional Superman lore. Um, this is basically a what if scenario. What if Superman, instead of landing in Kansas, or in Smallville, actually lands in the Soviet Union in the late 30s in Ukraine specifically, and becomes the Superman character, but surrounded now by this specific political regime and being influenced by said culture and by said ideals, and how that impacts other parts of the world, specifically that of America. Um, so so yeah, I gotta say, of the books that I've read so far, I've read a Supergirl comic. I did All Star Superman very recently, which I just got the book for, by the way. Actually, I got the what was it, the trade paperback, or yeah, paperback version. Um, I gotta say, of all the books that I've read so far, in terms of Superman, or at least Superman oriented stuff, I gotta say this is my favorite. And I know a lot of people like All Star Superman, and I think that in terms of just defining Superman, All Star Superman definitely, I think, carries that definition of what Superman truly is supposed to be. Um, but but I think that in terms of just providing a different take and providing something unique, and ultimately, providing such an interesting um, circumstance, this just I felt was very intriguing. I was worried because I thought that maybe this would fall into some kind of political jargon that wasn't exactly moving this character in a specific direction. But I was very actually happy to see that. Yeah, I mean, as much as it is surrounded by a political environment, it is taking interest in its characters, and specifically in the ideologies of both Superman and Lex Luthor. Because Superman in this represents the Soviet Union, where Lex Luthor in this is representing the American people. Um, and throughout the book, we see how each person, kind of deals with, their ideals, and also deals with people around them. And what you really get to see is how they are very much the same. They don't exactly stray too far from each other, and especially when you get to the end of the book, you realize that that statement holds a lot of value, because one might say that they are related. If not to spoil anything, but I think it's heavily implied. What I just said there. Um, but this is just a review. I mean, obviously there'll be spoilers. So if you're not wanting to read the book, if you want to read the book for yourself, go read it. But there will be spoilers in this. I will be discussing about key points in the book, specifically the ending, because the ending I thought originally I was just like, I don't know about this, but then when I really started to think about it and how it relates to the plot, it's actually in some ways kind of a scary ending, and I really like it. This whole idea, just to get into it, thing that I was kind of implying, that this Superman that we both believed to be, Kal-El, son of Krypton, comes from an alien planet. Turns out that he is actually from Earth's future, and he is the son of a descendant of Lex Luthor. So it's Lex Luthor's grandson, or one of Lex Luthor's, one of Lex Luthor's grandsons from the far, far, far future. Um, and when you go through the entire book, like I said, it is essentially showing you Superman and Lex Luthor's dealings within their ideologies. When you look at Lex Luthor, he is obsessed. He is very much about his agendas, and um, he's cruel, but he's calculated. He's not one to make very rash decisions or very openly, bad decisions. He tries to make a very clean public image, but and simultaneously also exercising his own agendas. He does what he has to do to serve his people, but he does it. The layering in that is that he also gets to do what he truly wants to do. With more power, he gets to have more control. Um, Whereas for Superman, we see him in the Soviet Union. We see how how he deals with his power, and how he is actually more or less blind to his own actions, and blind to how he exercises that power, and blind to the kind of cruelty that he does to his own people. Like, there's this whole thing about the Superman robots, where I love how they actually changed that up, because with the Superman robots, as far as I've seen with like James Gunn's Superman, they're just kind of servants to him, but they were like, I don't know if they were pre-built or built by him, um, but uh, they were just as they are. Whereas in this, Superman robots are the consequence of stepping out of line, of within his authority, within his regime. You become a Superman robot, uh, where Brainiac, who serves as his second, actually messes with your brain as like mechanics, and you're basically now a servant, a slave, and always on like a happy pill of some kind, um, to keep you under control. And within this world, they extend that to other members that we are familiar with in the DC universe. We have a Batman in this universe. We have a Wonder Woman in this universe. We have a Green Lantern, um, and we have a Flash. We have a Green Arrow, or at least we have Barry Allen and Oliver Queen. Um, but primarily, so it's four heroes. We have Batman, Superman, Wonder Woman, and Green Lantern. And I really like how they portray all the characters except for one, which we'll get into in a second. But starting with Green Lantern, I really like this take on Green Lantern. I really like this, um, kind of in some ways borrowing the origin of like Green Arrow to some extent based on the TV show, where he's like isolated and he's been tortured, and because of that, he has developed a great sense of imagination, but also a you know a a willpower to survive, to endure. And through Lex Luthor and what he desires, and ultimately how he, is able to. His whole thing about Lex Luthor again is about control, and within the pocket, that mentality that Hal Jordan possesses. This is Hal Jordan, not John Stewart. It's easier for him to be controlled because he's not exactly the most stable of minds once you understand his whole backstory. Um, but it's a twisted, version of Green Lantern that is a servant to Lex. Um, and then we get into Batman, and I didn't know how to take it at first, but when we started seeing the story unfold with him and the pocket that he is in, I really like it. I really, really like it. The only thing that I wish happened is that, and I kind of was thinking that they were leading up to it, they did suggest it, at some point, um, is that I was hoping that Batman was going to kill Peter, which, by the way, that character, especially Peter, I really liked that character. I know he is not a good person, but I like the nuance within that character that, he has regrets and that he is um, mournful of his actions. He's not exactly, um, a inherently bad person. He just has made bad decisions, you know, um, and the consequence to that is actually creating the Batman, and a Batman that doesn't reside from Gotham City, a Batman that was born in Russian soil, and because of the regime that Superman has, and being blind to his to his actions, or at least at the time of when this was happening, this was during Stalin's time. So Superman didn't take on the role of responsibility just yet, um, but it's to present a more politically charged Batman, and a Batman who is essentially a terrorist, um, and ends up working with Lex Luthor, all these little things, that create a very different, Batman character. And I really like that. For the short time that he's in the book, I thought it was kind of an interesting take. Where I start to find issues with the book is a lot to do with just, um, in my, at least to what I just read, some of the resolutions I feel aren't exactly as well written as much as trying to just kind of escape a certain progression. The whole point of Superman, the envelope, the letter that snaps him out of his whole ideals, and he starts to realize his own faults within his regime and his actions, and kind of just disbanding the whole thing entirely and deciding to live a normal life. I think that that's interesting on paper, but I think that by how it was executed, it just felt a little sloppy to me. It felt like we are just kind of just like they kind of didn't have much more story to tell, so they just felt the need to just find a way to end that part quickly. Um, so I didn't really exactly like that. I liked where things ended up, in terms of an end, but just that specific point of because it seemed as though Superman was leading itself down like basically the path of injustice, where Superman was eventually going to become this like this certain kind of character. He's very naive and he's very blind to his actions. He's basically a dictator already, but he is blind to his own dictation. Um, and with where things were moving, I thought that he was going to become uh, less uh, less caring in wanting to be violent and all that, but instead it's more how do we neutralize him by putting a mirror basically to him. And you know it's interesting in that respect. I just think that the way it was handled at the end just felt a little sloppy to me. um, I also think that the women in this comic, I feel, are very underused. I don't think that Lois or Wonder Woman, I felt, were that well utilized. They basically fall into, um, as much as the book has a a relation being established between Superman and Lex Luthor in terms of their ideals and how they choose to exercise those ideals. The consequence to their ideals is how they also impact the how they impact their relationships on on a social level, or just on a on a more intimate scene. In the case of Lex Luthor, he distanced himself quite a bit from his wife to further along his ambitions, and yet Lois stays and never decides to divorce him, or ever just decides to go off and be with somebody else, and is pretty much enwrapped in a toxic relationship. Whereas Wonder Woman, who develops a interest in Superman, does decide to leave him at some point after she is depowered, and she is also feels just not valued around him. He She then decides to leave. Um, but I just feel as though that they just devolve, or just are ultimately characters of victimization. They don't feel like that they are characters that have strength to their own. They just feel like that they're victims, and I wish that that wasn't really the case when it came to these characters, especially a strong character like Wonder Woman. I think it would be really cool if she had, more to her than just that. Um, and especially Lois. Like, Lois just really doesn't. In some ways, she doesn't feel like she needs to exist in the story at all, because she just doesn't have a function at all in the story. Um, but as it stands, I really like the story. I really like how um, how it all kind of comes full circle. I love how you know it is a story ultimately, especially knowing the twist at the end. With the Superman not being from Krypton, but being a descendant of Lex Luthor. Um, or like a grandson of Lex Luthor. I think that it really puts the whole story in a certain light. And basically, in terms of a political commentary, regardless of who it is, regardless of who comes up on top, they're going to bring about some form of destruction, and it is unavoidable. And to some extent, especially now, some people may say that this book is quite timely if you're reading it. Um, in some ways, maybe it is, maybe it's not. I don't know, depending on where you fall politically. Um, but I really like that being the last impact of the book, is knowing that everything that had just transpired is set in stone, and that it is unavoidable, and very similar to that of, like, political to politics in of itself, and politicians and how they act. It's not really about picking the better person. It's about picking the better the better morals. The better, who has the higher moral ground. And in the case of the story, it is Lex Luthor, but the irony within that is that he is also the person uh, who who I don't know if I necessarily say, well, he'll bring about the destruction. I mean, he does. He is ultimately the person who brings the destruction, or brings about the like brings about. I don't know if I want to call it destruction. I don't know. I guess you could say, like, all of what is to come. Like, it's destiny. Yeah, I guess ultimately for Lex Luthor, and it's probably within his ego something that he truly, is happy with. Um, but it's basically to say that the fate of humanity is forever, decided. And I really, really like, that lasting feeling, and how it kind of relates to the whole book about regardless of whoever came up on top, regardless of whoever whose agendas were going to win out. Ultimately, um, the ultimately the destruction is to come, and the unraveling is to happen. Um, so So yeah, I really like this book. I really, really like this comic. I think that there are, like I said, a few things here and there that I wasn't really fond of. I wasn't fond of Brainiac in this. I think he looked cool, but I don't think he was really that well developed. There's a point where he, decides to do a reveal that, oh, I was never in control. But I had to remind myself that, oh yeah, was he reprogrammed? Like I didn't catch that. I thought that he just flat out was serving Superman. I never got the impression that he was reprogrammed. Um, but but yeah, I didn't really. I mean, I didn't. I get in the line of how that tracks, because ultimately this the uh, like the first time we meet Brainiac in the book and how long that plays to then where things end up at the end. It's like, yeah, it kind of is a seeding of like, yeah, Lex perhaps had contingency plans or something, planned out in advance many years ago. Maybe. Or maybe it's the ego talking, I don't know, from Lex, who knows. A happenstance maybe. Um, but yeah, I wasn't really crazy about Brainiac's development, and I just think that the women in the book just kind of fell to like victims. They didn't really feel like they were that well developed or given as much of a purpose in the story. Um, but I really like, I really like the commentary. I really like I really like how they paint this Superman. He is a very flawed character. He is very blind to his actions, but he is noble. He is somebody who is still wanting to hold certain values. He never chooses violence. He's not someone uh, who's going to just destroy a city or level a town. This isn't what the Superman will do. He is somebody who will do what he believes is the right thing, but unfortunately, his ideals, are tied to his ego, and because there are things that end up happening that he just is blind to, and eventually, as the book does, in my opinion, in a little bit of a sloppy way, in a kind of a messy way, not messy, but just kind of clunky. He does come to realize his fault, and he decides to live out a normal life afterwards. Um, which is fitting, but I think that way of end could have been told better, in my opinion. But I like that. I like Lex. He is a classic Lex. Except he is much more manipulative and much more subtle. And the he ultimately gets what he wants. It's just the real consequences. Just you know, um, I mean, I guess really nothing, because his name gets to live on for like generations. It's just that the world as it is eventually going to die out, and it's at this point it's really legacy that is established. But I will admit, though, the ending to some extent it's a little cheesy, because it's like kind of the like, oh, it's Jor-El, oh, it's like those names that are dropped in. It's like, okay, it's a little on the nose. But once you put it in the perspective of the book, just talking about the political, agendas at play with Superman and Lex Luthor, and how they both, you know, intertwine and relate very much so. It does leave a very specific impact. Um, so so yeah, I thought it was a pretty good book. I thought it was a pretty good comic, and between the three I've read so far, it's personally my favorite, because it's unique. It tells a different story, and I think that in terms of what it's overall trying to talk about, in that there is nothing but doom to be had, And in the vein of pop politics, it's not about picking the best person, it's picking the lesser of two evils. It's it's a very it's a very honest, message in my opinion. And I found that the way that it was told it was both fun and informative, and I just had a nice time, reading it. And I was actually curious to read more. I forgot the name of the book. I went because I went with my brother to an expo, and there were comics there. I forgot what the DC comic was, but it was something Ace. So I'll put it up here on the screen. I was curious about reading that next because you're reading Red Sun. I was just kind of interested. I saw that comic there, so I don't know. I might read that next. I don't know, or after I read my brother's book. But but yeah, those are my thoughts on Red Sun. If you guys have read Red Sun, let me know your thoughts in the comment section below. If you guys have seen the movie, also let me know. Is it a good adaptation? Is it faithful? Is it worth watching at all? Let me know. Let me know all your thoughts in the comment section below. And that's gonna be it for this video, guys. Thank you guys for tuning in. And until then, I will catch you guys in the next video. Bye.